For Eric J on Sports, I'm Eric J, and this is what I think. The biggest story in sports right now is not Juan Soto of the Washington Nationals turning down almost $500 million over 15 years to continue playing baseball in Washington, D.C. And the biggest story in sports right now is not LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and Russell Westbrook pretending that everything is all good and stating that they're all going to be a cohesive unit as they head into the 2022-2023 NBA season. The biggest story in sports right now is the retirement of WWE Chairman and CEO Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Now, why is that the biggest story in sports? It's the biggest story in sports. It's the biggest story in pop culture. It's the biggest story in entertainment. It's the biggest story going right now. And the reason is because anybody who's ever paid attention to Vince McMahon or watched WWF or WWE or know anything about that company, the perception was that Vince would die before he left his company. Wrestling, professional wrestling, sports entertainment, WWE was in his blood. And I'm not saying that figuratively. I'm not being facetious. Professional wrestling and WWE was literally in his blood. Vince McMahon's grandfather, Jess McMahon, was one of the biggest pro wrestling promoters in the country. He worked out of the Northeast, the New York area, and he promoted there for years. And then as he got older, he passed the family business on to his son, Vincent J. McMahon. Vincent J. McMahon, otherwise known as Vince McMahon Sr., became the biggest promoter in the Northeast area. He promoted Madison Square Garden and all the big shows in that area, and he was the original founder of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, or the WWF. He was the guy who had Bruno Sammartino as champion, and he had Ivan Koloff as champion, and he had Stan Stasiak as champion, and superstar Billy Graham and Pedro Morales as world heavyweight champion. He was that guy. He was the guy who ran the WWF. And then around 1984, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, otherwise known as Vince McMahon Jr., bought the company from his dad. Now, those of us who were watching WWF at that time, because Vince dropped one W and it made it just World Wrestling Federation, those of us who were watching WWF around that era, during the Hulkamania era, we thought Vince McMahon was just an announcer, just the guy with the gravelly voice. Oh my God, it's WWF live! We thought Vince was that guy. We saw him on TV. We saw him do the interviews. We all saw the iconic interview and picture where Vince is standing on the floor and they're shooting Andre the Giant from the waist up while he stands on a milk crate. So Andre looks like he's about 2 feet taller than Vince. If you've ever seen that interview or you've ever seen that picture, then you know that they got Andre touching the sky and Vince looking like Vince, who stands about 6'2" himself, looking like he's 2 feet shorter than Andre the Giant, who was billed at 7'4". So we thought he was just announcer guy. That was almost 40 years ago. So yeah, for those of you who didn't pay attention to the math right then, I am older than 40 years old. So that's who we knew Vince McMahon was. Over time, we came to understand that Vince was the guy pulling the strings. Vince was the puppet master. It came to fruition when Vince McMahon told everybody, I'm Vince McMahon and I'm chairman and CEO of WWF. When he did the whole Bret screwed Bret thing after the Montreal screw job, that whole era was when Vince exposed himself while exposing the business. But then we knew Vince was the chairman. We knew that Vince was in charge. But then as you go through time, by that point in life, by Montreal screw job time, that's 20 years in to Vince running the company. Vince is 50 some odd years old at that point. Now you look ahead to 2022, Vince is 77 years old. He's run WWF for the last 40 years, which means he's been running that company since he was just at the age when professional athletes are starting to retire from their sport. Vince has been running the company, made himself into a billionaire. made himself one of the most famous men on the planet, one of the richest men on the planet, and one of the most renowned men on the planet, and revered and reviled men on the planet. Revered because he was a millionaire who made himself into a billionaire, reviled because of some of his business practices, like calling people independent contractors and not allowing them to make money anyplace else, like not paying for medical benefits for your employees who signed a contract with exclusivity to your company, but then telling them you're not an employee, you're an independent contractor, but you can't go make any money anywhere else. Those types of things. Making the wrestlers pay for their own travel, but you require them to work 200 days a year plus in different cities all around the country and around the world. Revered and reviled. But you would have thought that he would never give away his throne of power. He surrounded himself with yes men and sycophants. Kevin Dunn, Bruce Pritchard, John Laurinaitis. He brought in Nick Khan and the rest of his power structure. Michael Hayes, Jerry Briscoe, Pat Patterson, Stephanie McMahon, Triple H, Shane McMahon. This was the inner circle of Vince McMahon. People who he'd known for 40 years, or his own family. So you would have thought that Vince would have had to have been pulled away. They would have had to snatch the reins of power of WWF or WWE from his cold, dead hands. But no. Vince announced that he was retiring from his position as chairman and CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment. But why? Well, here's why. Because it's better to quit than be fired. If you've ever had a real job, and I've had a few, it is better to quit than be fired. When you quit, you control the narrative. When you're fired, you don't. The difference between being fired and quit is when you're fired, you can collect unemployment insurance, and when you quit, you can't. But it's better to quit than be fired because you control the narrative. For the rest of your life, you can tell whoever asks you, I used to work for WWE, but I quit. As opposed to, I used to work for WWE, but I was fired. Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, Adam Cole, Bully Ray quit WWE. Ember Moon, Cesaro, Rusev were fired. Difference. When you quit WWE, you can go work wherever you want. When you're fired from WWE, you have to wait 90 days before you can go work wherever you want. There's the difference. But Vince quit to keep from being fired because Vince has gotten himself into a little trouble because there are multiple women, including former female wrestlers who were employed by WWE, making claims and allegations that Vince was sexually inappropriate with them and then paid them to keep quiet. Vince had sexual relationships outside of his marriage to Linda McMahon, senatorial candidate Linda McMahon. He had relationships outside of his marriage with women and then paid them to keep quiet. And somehow the stories of these relationships came to light, which means he paid somebody to be quiet, but they did not stay quiet, which means if I was Vince, I would be asking for a refund. And if the story is true that he paid one woman $3 million to be quiet, and then the story came out, I would be asking for my $3 million back, plus interest over however many years she kept quiet until she didn't. But that's a different story for a different day. But as a result of the issue that Vince is having with his sexual misconduct and his sexual misgivings, Vince has put himself in a position to where his board of directors, and the board of directors being his power circle, and the stockholders who own shares of this publicly traded company are looking at him going, do we want to continue to do business with you? Advertisers are looking at him going, do we want to do business with you in the future? Peacock, the company that bought the WWE network and airs WWE programming, is looking at Vince saying, do we want to continue to do business with you? So now, because Vince sees himself losing money hand over fist, or potentially losing money hand over fist, he decides, might as well get while the getting is good. and control my narrative. So he stepped down. He retired, as opposed to dying in office, like Abraham Lincoln. He stepped down, as opposed to dying in office like a Supreme Court justice, or like the Pope. He stepped down, as opposed to dying in office. And now Stephanie McMahon is in charge. Stephanie McMahon is now the new chairman and CEO, and Triple H is the new executive vice president in charge of talent relations. So they have all the power now. So the company stays in the family. But Vince retiring is a big deal simply because, as I said, no one ever thought it would happen. He was never going to give up his company. He was never going to give up his job. But he did. But he did because he had to, not because he wanted to. He controlled his narrative by quitting to keep from being fired. But he created the problem that he had to try to repair by quitting his job. Remember to like and share this video and subscribe to this channel, and visit my new website at the URL in the description below. And follow me on Facebook at Eric J on Sports 1 and on Instagram and Twitter at Eric J on Sports. And for Eric J on Sports, I'm Eric J, and this is what I think.